heading into this phase of the election, the polls seem to show Donald Trump with a slight edge, and certainly a base that is fired up. But there is more happening behind the scenes, and the big question is, what's actually going to happen on election night? I'm really pleased to bring in one of the absolute best on the topic, direct from Washington, D.C., CT Group Managing Director Larry Grossman. Larry, thanks so much for coming on the program here. Now, Trump is up in all the poll averages, and he's leading in the swing states, it looks like, but you have been in the business a long time, and you think there may be some more things happening behind these headline numbers. Tell us about it.
I think you have to look at the numbers, but which we always pay attention to in every election, right? Whether they're the national numbers to get a sense of what's going on in the country or in the 6 or 7 swing states. But I do think there's a lot that you have to look at. You have to look at everything from the various groups that that make up the demographics of each of the parties, and then you have to look at the things that the campaigns are doing or not doing on the ground.
And tell us about the enthusiasm for this race. I mean, a lot of people say that people are going to vote for Trump to cast a vote against Biden, and Biden, to cast a vote against Trump. How much of this is leading to this sort of situation where you could have a very low turnout in this election?
I think people are looking at this as an election of if not historically low turnouts, at least recently low turnouts. We had very high turnouts in the Obama years. We had a very low turnout nationally in 2016 in the first Clinton versus Trump election, with very high turnouts in 2020. But people are looking at numbers that could be below the 2016 numbers. I apologize.
And what are the big issues that are going to be driving these voters? I mean, I see that obviously on the Republican side, migration and the border, that's the thing that they're pushing very hard to fire everybody up. But it looks like the Democrats are going to push abortion, reproductive rights to try and get those suburban voters back, suburban female voters. Is that going to be enough for them to get the turnout they need to win back these polls from where Trump seems to be in a commanding position?
I think everywhere we've seen that issue about reproductive rights, basically women's health issues, more generally, it's been a winner for the Democrats, whether that was Michigan a couple of years ago, Ohio more recently. And I think it will be something that will get women to the polls, Democratic women to the polls, in good numbers, the type of numbers that obviously the president needs in 6 or 7 states.
Yeah, and let's talk about some of these swing states. I mean, in the latest Marist, Pennsylvania poll, they've got Trump up by 2, but the latest Morning Consult poll has Biden up by a point. How are we sorting out between the signal and the noise in all of these polls? And just to throw something else into the mix, states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, how much would a VP pick like J.D. Vance for Donald Trump help advance his cause?
Well, let's start with the latter question about places like Ohio. I think the Democrats aren't focusing on Ohio other than to get out as many Democrats as they can, because there's a very important Senate race in Ohio where the incumbent Sherrod Brown, who is up for re-election, somebody who's a close ally of the president, somebody who's very important for the Democrats to maintain their majority in the U.S. Senate. But in terms of watching the polls on a daily basis, I think you can get yourself into a little bit of a dizzy state by just actually looking at the number of polls that are being done on a daily basis in each of the states. But it's important to do nonetheless, because as you mentioned earlier, this issue of enthusiasm is important, and we do see that track in the polls. But there are so many polls going on all the time, it's sometimes hard to keep track of who's up by 1 point or who's down by a half a point.
Yeah, and that almost doesn't matter at this sort of stage, does it? But also, let's talk about states like Virginia. I mean, that should be solidly Democratic, I think, but some people have that as a bit of a toss-up at the moment. What's your read on Virginia right now?
I think the sense in Virginia, you obviously have a Senate race. Tim Kaine, who is Hillary Clinton's running mate, is up for re-election in the Senate. There's a couple of very important congressional seats, House seats, that are up that the Democrats need to win or protect in the fall. And I think you'll see a lot of money being spent by the Democrats here in Northern Virginia, the Washington, D.C. area, as well as a little further south down in what is the Virginia Beach area here. a largely urban African American area. But I think the Democrats, keep an eye on Virginia. But I think on election night, Virginia would be one that people will be surprised if it's not called early for the Democrats.
Yeah, no, look, I think that's probably right. But just you mentioned the African-American vote. We hear a lot about that starting to shift to Trump, in some considerable numbers, according to some polls. How much of that do you think is actually real? And, given some of the urban concentrations, would that shift some big votes in big states with a lot of electoral votes but high urban populations, like New York or Illinois?
James, I think I don't think we worry about New York or Illinois, but I do think the Democrats are paying close attention to the African-American vote. But let's take a step back. Let's look at the former president's numbers for just a second, because it's important too. I think he's got a very low ceiling. I think he's stuck and always will be in this election at 42 or 43%. He's not going to get any more than that. So the best way for him to win is to weaken the base of the president's accomplishments with places like the African-American vote around the swing states. So he's got to either do one of two things. He's got to attract former Biden voters over to him, or I think what's more likely to happen is people become disinterested and don't come out and vote on Election Day in November. So I don't see the African-American vote going for, and we're really talking about 20 to 40-year-old African-American men, I don't see them going in large numbers for former President Trump. The big issue for the Democrats is how do you get them to come out and vote on Election Day for the President of the United States, for President Biden. So I think it's something that people are paying very close attention to. But there, I think you may have also seen in the news last week, the president and vice president launched a big initiative last week to focus on African-American voters. They kicked it off up in Philadelphia, which, is not only the president's home turf, but also a state, Pennsylvania, which he's got to win to be reelected.
Absolutely fascinating. Larry Grossman, CT Group, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the U.S. Report.
Thank you for having me.
Really appreciate it. Thanks, Larry.